Hi, you've clicked on to today's tropical tidbit for Monday, June 17th. Here we are in the Atlantic, and what was Invest 93L has now become Tropical Depression 2 here, moving into Belize tonight. And the system was able just barely to become a tropical depression and close off a circulation center just before it moved into Belize today, allowing the NHC to upgrade it. We did discuss the possibility of this happening in the Gulf of Honduras, and it was just able to close off that circulation and get upgraded. But regardless, this will not become a strong system. It spent too much time over land, as we discussed, and will be mainly a rain and flooding issue for areas of Central America here. And then it's possible that it could pop out the other side in the Bay of Campeche and to have a little bit of time over water to try to redevelop. In fact, here's the NHC forecast, which does show a little bit of time over water here, and it thinks it will have time to become Tropical Storm Barry before a second landfall in eastern Mexico. But this is unlikely to become very strong. Again, water time is very limited. The strong ridge to the north will keep this on a fairly southerly track, and this will be, again, rainfall issue for these areas, nothing more than that. Fairly typical early season depression here. Here's the radar showing the center moving ashore now. You can kind of see the rotation, even though this is a slow loop, moving in north of Monkey River. Belize, again, strong rain bands coming ashore, especially over high terrain, will cause flooding issues, perhaps for some of these regions. So that will be the main threat to look out for. Now, we discussed that early July will likely be our next target period for enhanced activity in the Atlantic. We have this system here, but it is, in a sense, kind of random in the grand scheme of things because the MJO is in a suppressive phase for the Atlantic right now, and in general, this area should be fairly quiet for the next couple of weeks, barring another random pop-up storm. The Atlantic will not be favored heavily again until early July, when the MJO comes over and brings a lot of upward motion to this region again, and sometime near or after the July 4th holiday and through middle of July, we'll probably be seeing an enhanced period of activity in the Atlantic. Can't guarantee a storm out of it, but as we discussed yesterday, the stars are aligning again, similar as they did for Andrea, and when the MJO comes back, may provide the opportunity for something else to start brewing down here, so we will have to watch that. But for now, remaining quiet for the foreseeable future. So for now, I want to talk a little bit about the rest of the season as a whole, because we haven't touched on that in a while. I released my hurricane outlook in mid-March, and we've discussed a couple of things since then, but the models do keep updating every month, and it's been interesting the last couple of months. Almost every forecast out there was for a active hurricane season, including most of the models which came on board with some of my ideas from March, where they were showing an unfavorable look for the season in December and January, and then the models came over to my camp near the time of my forecast and started showing more favorable conditions in April. But now in May and June, these models have started to trend back the other way. Here's the European, which is one of our best models, showing higher than normal sea level pressures here for the Atlantic during the July, August, September period. This is the June forecast update for this month, showing for the summer what would be a region of sinking air over the Atlantic. That's what those high pressures represent, and that is bad for the tropics. It would mean fewer storms. And it's interesting because the European has now flipped, and it's possible that this is because it's showing an El Nino pattern with this warm tongue of water. These are the sea surface temperature anomalies showing up for the summer in the equatorial Pacific. And this is an El Nino, but I suspect that the Euro might be overreacting a little bit to this. You see it shows a Nino, but it's also a little bit weighted towards the west. Much warmer than normal Pacific warm pool in here is not what you typically see during an El Nino, and we have cooler water west of South America here. Which indicates that this is more like a Modiki type El Nino, and this is fairly rare. It's where the warm tongue is shifted towards the west. We don't get it all the time. The last time we had it was in 2004, which actually happened to become an active Atlantic hurricane season, and it's possible that the European is overreacting a little bit to this, because when the warm water is displaced more to the west like this, you're still kind of favoring upward motion in the typical western Pacific basin area, and then especially when I see this. See how cool the Indian Ocean is? This is also somewhat atypical for an El Nino, and when you get the Indian Ocean cool and the western Pacific warm pool warm, it means that you get rising air here, sinking air here, and that tends to promote rising air over the African continent and the tropical Atlantic, with sinking air over the cool water in the equatorial eastern Pacific. And these four regions where you have rising air, sinking, sinking, rising is a very typical pattern for active Atlantic hurricane seasons. And it's hard for me to imagine that it's actually going to be as unfavorable as the European claims. You can see that the Brazilian model actually disagrees with the Euro, and the reason I put the Brazilian model up here is because it's only been around for a little while, so we don't really know how good it is yet. We've only had its output for a couple of years, but during 2011 and 2012, which are the 2 years we have archived, it actually beat the European in the mean sea level pressure anomaly fields. Qualitatively, from what I looked at during the July, August, September period, it beat the Euro globally. And it did very well and performed very well in the Atlantic and the rest of the globe for that matter over the last couple of years. And you can see here it's showing below normal pressures in the tropical Atlantic, which is interesting to me because now it's in a fight with the Euro, and I'd like to see which one of those models win. The Euro, UK Met, and CFS have all shifted towards an unfavorable pattern in the Atlantic, and the Brazilian model and the Japanese model are remaining fairly favorable for the Atlantic over the summer. So there's a model fight going on now. And here's what the sea surface temperatures look like right now. Some of my reasoning is still really based off this. I keep harping on the ocean, but it's really important because that's what generates the upward motion necessary to generate storms. Where you have warm water, air will tend to rise, and especially where you have warm water relative to the surroundings, the air will tend to rise, because when you have cooler water here in the eastern Pacific, cool water in the mid-Atlantic, and then warm water in between, remember the air is going to try to sink in the regions of cold water, which helps air converge and pile up in the region of warm water. And those two things together mean that the air is going to try to rise in here. And that doesn't really go away. Even on the Euro forecast, notice it wasn't much different. And I still think this really favors the Atlantic more than some of the models are giving it credit for. And again, see, the warm pool in the western Pacific is warm, the Indian Ocean is cold. And this happens a lot in years where the Atlantic is active. And you don't have to take my word for it. Here are the composite sea surface temperature anomalies for the most active hurricane seasons that we have recorded for the Atlantic. These are the most active years you're going to find, and this is the June sea surface temperature anomaly. See how similar it is to today. See the cold water anomalies here. Cold Indian Ocean, this is very important, and the warmer western Pacific warm pool in general, with warm water in the tropical Atlantic and cooler water up here in the north, showing the Atlantic tripole. Very similar to what we have right now, and this is what we have during the years when the Atlantic is active. So I'm not making this up. This is a legitimate technique to use. The Atlantic tends to be active when the ocean looks like this. So even though the computers are starting to turn against me a little bit, I'm sticking with my forecast for mid-March for a more active than normal season. 14 to 16 storms, long-term average is 12, 8 to 10 hurricanes, 3 to 5 major, with the potential for 2 or 3 hurricanes to make landfall on U.S. soil. The long-term average for those is 1.5 landfalls per year. So I'm forecasting a little bit above average chance for that. And one of the reasons for that is now that we're getting into the early season here, we can actually start looking at the steering patterns in the Atlantic, because some of these start to carry over into later in the season. This is the 500 millibar height anomalies from late May through mid-June, and you can see anomalous ridging here showing up over the northwest Atlantic, and this means a lack of troughs passing through this area. When you get troughs passing through here, it tends to recurve storms harmlessly out to sea, but now this year what we're seeing is a lack of troughing. And this is a lot opposite than the last 3 years. These are 2009 through 2012 June 500 millibar height anomalies. Notice how low they are, indicating troughing over the northern Atlantic with a big negative NAO signature up here. And with the exception of Irene and Sandy, all storms were recurved east of the U.S. during these 3 years. And it's really amazing considering we had 19 named storms in 2010, 2011, and 2012, that it really did recurve most of the storms away. And this year we have the opposite pattern, which is a little concerning, and it may be able to steer more storms towards land because of the lack of troughing to steer them away, regardless of the level of activity we get. And of course, everyone can be hit in every year. I personally think the Eastern Caribbean into the eastern United States is favored for landfalls this year relative to the other areas, but this is difficult to forecast, certainly more difficult than the overall activity level. And of course, any year can hit anybody, and so everyone please be prepared for this year. And again, here is Tropical Depression 2 moving into Central America. Will be nothing but a rain threat for these areas in here, and will move fairly harmlessly into Mexico. The flooding could be a problem. Again, the Atlantic is likely to remain fairly quiet until large-scale upward motion comes back into this area of the world during the first 2 weeks of July as the MJO comes back over, which I talked about in the last video, which you can go take a look at if you would like. And that will be likely when we light up again. Still early in the season, not a ton of activity yet, but I still have a feeling this year will end up being more active than normal, so stay tuned and we shall see what happens.